Hello and welcome to Smart Cities Conversations. I'm George Vukotic, the new director of the Center for Research in the area of Innovation and Smart Cities, and I welcome you to the University of Wisconsin at Parkside. Today, we have a panel that we're going to work with, individuals doing individual presentations. We have representatives Joe Mariani from Deloitte to give us an overview on smart cities, Lisa Brown from Johnson Controls to give us a little bit more on healthy buildings and how they come into play with smart cities. Then we have not only one, but two mayors from very important cities. We have Mayor Corey Mason from Racine, Wisconsin, and in 2019, they were the smallest city with a population of almost 80,000 to win the Smart Cities designation. And then we also have Mayor John Antamarian, who is working on a number of projects in Kenosha, Wisconsin, to change the direction and improve things that are going on there. With that, I would like to welcome everybody, and from there, I want to remind you to submit your questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them. They will be submitted. If you'd like to indicate your first name or the country, we have a global audience today. So if you'd like to indicate the country you're coming from, feel free to submit the questions. We'll try to get them in depending on time, and then we'll pick it up from there. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Joe Mariani from Deloitte Consulting.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much, George. So as George said, I'm Joe Mariani. I'm with Deloitte's Center for Government Insights, which is really our non-commercial think tank covering all things government, right? So all the major challenges facing governments at the federal, state, and local level. To give you kind of some sense of just what that looks like, even my research portfolio inside the center covers everything from government innovation on one hand and digital transformation all the way through to defense, national security, law enforcement, intelligence agencies. But prior to that, I actually led our firm's research into Internet of Things, and kind of through that touched on a lot of the smart cities work. So I actually want to talk to you a little bit about today about kind of just the breadth of our research, some of the high level ideas that we touch on, some of the more interesting ideas that we have, and hopefully some of those things can prick some ideas and kind of start a conversation for later on. Great. There's a little bit about the center. But really, to kind of kick it off, I want to start off with, if we're going to talk about smart cities, really probably the place to start with, and I'm not sure if we could go to the next slide, is probably just what is a smart city, right? If we think about it, even in terms of visualizing it in our head, if you're like me and probably most people, you picture something like that, right? It's this big built environment, dense, really vertical glass and steel. There's lots of technology there, right? You have some 5G antennas, some connected LED streetlights there. And it's really that kind of thing that strikes us as what a smart city is, right? It's a city, it's dense, it's built up, it's smart in that it's just jammed with technology. But want to pose a question of, what about this, right? What about this large rural area, maybe, largely based on agriculture? It's not dense, it's got lots of people spread out. Can that be a smart city? And I'd like to argue that yes, absolutely, right? And there's lots of research that touches on, the impact of Internet of Things on agriculture is significant. Projections are 70% increase in yields over the next 30 years, things along those lines. It can touch everything from supply chain and making sure, milk and other goods are not contaminated from the farm through to the customer end of the supply chain. Animal welfare, right? Looking at when you have stock spread over large areas, you can find cows that are sitting down, so perhaps signs that they're ill, and you can treat those specific animals rather than trying to do prophylactic antibiotics across an entire herd. Even changing how land rents are done. Rather than buy an acre, you can actually do it using smart contracts, right? So you're actually based it on actual productivity. And that even more basically, rural areas are lots of people spread out, and they may benefit from the connectivity that digital technology can bring, even more so than those in kind of dense urban environments. So I think the idea is if you're thinking about that right now, you're like, hang on, that doesn't sound anything like smart cities. Those uses are completely different. They touch on supply chains and things like that. And I think the idea is, yes, absolutely, right? If we go to the next slide, yeah. I think the idea is, smart cities don't have to be smart. And they don't even have to be cities. Smart in the sense of, it's not just technology and it's not just dense urban environments. When we're talking about a smart city, I would argue that city is really just shorthand for any community that has collective goals that they want to achieve. And smart then is really not just about the fanciest, latest digital technology, but it's about aligning all the right tools to achieve those goals. And so in that sense, right, if we think about that very first question, what is a smart city and what does it look like? There's almost not an answer, right? Because it doesn't look like anything. Because a smart city is not a particular place. It's a process. It's a way of thinking. And that's kind of what we've tried to capture with our little circular framework there, right? You kind of start at the middle and work your way out based on what you want to achieve. And so you start at kind of that green level at the very beginning, which is, what is that collective goal? What are we trying to accomplish? When we talk to commercial companies on things like IoT, it's like from the narrowest to the largest, the simplest to the most difficult. It's efficiency, differentiation, new revenue. And you can kind of see the same thing with governments, municipalities, right? At the simplest level, it's kind of sustainability and efficiency, taking the things you do today and making it more efficient, getting more for less. If you add citizens into that, make it a little more complicated, you can start to talk about how do we increase their quality of life, right? What do we want to accomplish? How are we living? And you start to add in industry on top of that, academia, everybody, right? All the folks here today. Now you can start to talk about kind of the biggest thorny questions like economic growth. And once you do that, now you can have an easier frame of, all right, well, where do we do that? Where do we tackle it? Is that a mobility problem? Is it a safety problem? Is it an economy problem? And from there, that starts to, again, scope the technologies that you need to think about. Do we need, sensors and tags? Do we need RFID? Do we need all of these different things? Do we need, digital backbone and infrastructure? And from there, actually, ironically enough, that starts to then answer some of the other questions that tend to be some of the really big thorny barriers, like how do we fund this? How do we get financing for it? Because one of the things we actually found that was interesting looking at this, specifically at airports, was that there's a correlation between the goal you set out to achieve and what the right funding mechanisms are, right? If you're doing something narrow in scope, like sustainability, efficiency, often you can kind of self-fund that from within one budget line item. But as you get a little bigger, you need to start spreading it across budget line items because the benefits and costs are coming from different places. And you start to get to the most complicated ones, economic growth, new revenue. That's where you start to need to look at, not just operating expenditure, but capital expenditure, public-private partnerships, shared ownership, kind of new creative ways of getting that because they require more upfront funding. So go to the next slide. So the whole idea there is, if smart cities is a process, you need to think about them in kind of a structured way. It all starts with, kind of choosing what that outcome is. What's that collective goal you're going for? And then there's a data part to that too, right? Because it's not just choosing an outcome, but it's kind of choosing a measurable outcome and say, all right, what are we going to actually achieve and how are we going to make sure that we actually did that? So, a quick example running through all these is, New York City during the pandemic, they started shifting a lot of their government services to virtual, right? And what that meant was there was large portions of the population that weren't able to access those services, especially actually the most vulnerable, right? The poor, the elderly. So they had a problem that they realized, hey, we need an outcome here, and that's we need to connect those people. We need to kind of close the digital divide. And there's a data element. You can easily measure it. Hey, what's the percentage of those folks in New York City Housing Authority housing that have broadband access, right? There you go. And once you do that, you can start to think through, all right, what's the technology we're going to use to achieve that? So, right, if we're talking broadband, hey, we could do wired, we could do wireless, we could do broadband over power lines, we could do satellite, and you start to go through the pros and cons of each, right? Satellite, too expensive. Broadband over power lines, probably not extensible enough, growing enough. Wired, again, too expensive. So they ended up in wireless. And the great benefit of this structured process is it starts to make you think through all of these questions from different perspectives. And what the city quickly realizes, they had something that they didn't really think was that valuable, but that other stakeholders really valued. And that was ownership of rooftops. And so they were able to essentially trade access to the New York City Housing Authority rooftops to telecommunications companies that needed that to get the access. And they said, okay, if you install your wireless connectivity antennas up on the roofs, we'll give you access. But in exchange, you have to offer low-price broadband to the residents of those housing authorities, right? So it became this great win-win. The telcos got access to they could have never had, and which is, especially as 5G comes along, so much more important for them. And the city got what it needed in terms of that connectivity for those residents that were suffering from disconnection. But again, we can't leave it there, right? Because the goal isn't actually just technology and connecting folks. It's getting them access to the services. That's what we established at the beginning. And so you got to move on and continue to evaluate progress and design the implementations to break down the barriers for those people at the end. And in this case, what that meant was, hey, we're talking about elderly folks in housing projects. we can't just say, all right, your broadband is on, your problem is solved. So New York City gave them 10,000 tablet computers, and again, not just the tablets and said, here you go, but actually the training to go along with it. So it's some in-person training to actually make sure that happens. And that's how you start to get that progress. And our research actually kind of covers the whole spectrum of this, right? And it goes from choosing outcomes. We've covered everything from how do you kind of address homelessness problems, create more inclusive communities, even how do you create those smart rural communities we talked about, to all the different technologies involved, right? Everything from 5G to drones, smart airports like we've talked about, and even something that's in recent weeks become even more important and on top of everyone's mind with ransomware attacks is, okay, we're increasing all this technology, especially technology on things that weren't previously connected, things like waterworks and so on. How do we make sure those are cyber secure? And then once we do all that stuff, right, you can begin to evaluate progress. And we've worked with ESI and others to look at lots of different metrics to see how different cities are progressing. But more importantly than any kind of ranking, it's really progress is evaluated for each individual community as they make progress towards their goals. And then kind of the second maybe counterintuitive thing I'd like to say is, smart cities actually is just the same thing as government innovation. Because if we're thinking about it, right, smart city sounds a lot like, Wi-Fi connected trash cans and smart LED streetlights. And government innovation probably sounds like DARPA or at the state and local level, right, smart driver's license, startup accelerators, things like that. They don't seem the same, but if we use that new definition of, smart cities are communities aligned trying to achieve a collective goal, that's really just improving how we live our collective lives, which is just kind of the function of government. So, smart cities equals government innovation, and government innovation equals smart cities. And the reason that's important is because it opens up the aperture for a lot of solutions for achieving smart cities goals that aren't even just technology at all, right? We can start to use things like organizational innovation, regulatory innovation, all types of things like that. And shockingly enough, it actually kind of follows the same flow, right? Start with the outcomes you're looking for, and those can be, digital transformations. Or they can be things like government trust. And we found that actually, the digital innovations rely on organizational things like culture and leadership, and things like trust actually rely on the digital technologies too, right? The better you're able to deliver your services to citizens, the more likely you are to have trust. And then you can talk about, then how you do that, how you make the innovation, and then finally, and there's lots of fun stories we can talk about, I'm sure, in the panel with things like the Postal Service and rocket mail, and trying to deliver mail by cruise missile, and all sorts of crazy things along those lines. And then finally, kind of where government innovates. You can start to look at where these innovations are taking place and take cues from others and their success, so you can kind of be inspired by what's going on around you in a broader area. And then finally, if we want to think about all these things together, all these kind of counterintuitive things, and stick a nice, neat little tagline or bumper sticker on it, it's really this idea of like 3D thinking, right? You start with data on the outcomes. And the great thing here is, again, it doesn't have to be new technology creating data. Very often, especially for cities, it's data that you already have. So LA County during the pandemic was using a variety of data that they already had in terms of what's the population density, what's the type of infrastructure here, where are the cases, and using that to pull it all together in a single place and place where their kind of pre-positioned supplies would be, right? Everything from masks to water and so on. And then once you do that, then you can start to think through what the digital technologies are that are going to help you, move and manage and make sense out of that data. And again, that can be something new. It can be something like a digital backbone, like some of the really advanced cities like Cascais in Portugal bring all their municipal data from trash collection to law enforcement all into kind of one place. And then finally, once you do that, it's again taking that people-centered approach to understanding, all right, what are the barriers that stand in the way of people kind of using that technology as we expected. And then measuring to make sure they're actually getting towards and that we're achieving the outcome that we ultimately set out to achieve in the first place. And with that, hopefully that inspires some interesting bits and pieces along the way of all those random little insights. And if you want to read more about some of our research and dig into it a little more, you can go to deloitte.com/insights. Or if you want to find me, I'm always around. I'm actually just right down the road here in Kenosha. And I suppose luckily with the pandemic, I'm always here. Unluckily, I probably need a new picture there, but we're always here to talk and happy to continue the conversation.
Very good. Joe, great insights. A couple questions have come up. First one, you touched on things like smart contracts and data and availability. And I think the question today is there's so much of this available, but how do you decide how to best use it? How do you categorize it? How do you bring in, various individuals? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, it all starts with the goal, right? Because even small cities are going to have more data than is manageable by any one human. And then, you look at bigger and broader organizations, that actually becomes the central problem. So you think about, the Department of Defense is probably the largest organization in human history. And that's exactly the problem they have, right? You even if you wanted to, you physically couldn't take all the data and bring it into one giant data lake. And even if you did, you probably wouldn't want to, because then, even for a city, right, all your data about your citizens is there potentially lost, right? One data breach, you've lost everything. So it's much more about figuring out, what are we trying to solve with this new implementation? And then you can figure out, all right, what are the right data pieces? And then you can start to do things we often actually overlook, which is like, let's all agree on the definition of a data. So when we were doing this for airports, it actually turned out a big problem was just getting everyone to agree on, like, what does landing time mean, right? Because it means one thing for the pilots, it means one thing for the air traffic controllers, one thing for the airline, ground crew, and so on and so on. So even just getting those little things, it turns out to be difficult. So I'd actually say even those kind of data questions all come back to this, hey, we have to think through it in a kind of structured process way.
Got it. Very good. Question from Canada. How do the initiatives get started, and how are stakeholders best engaged at the beginning?
I think that's a great question. I think in some sense there's probably no single answer to how these things get started. I'd actually defer to the two mayors on how things actually get started and get rolling. But I think the second half of the question is exactly correct, right? You have to bring all the right stakeholders in at the right times. And very often that's kind of up front. And I think, probably coming from Toronto or from Canada, Toronto's quayside struggles probably highlight that, right? Because if we're talking about smart cities are improving our collective lives in certain ways, right? A key part of that is kind of what is our collective goals? That's a kind of fundamentally government mission. And you can't kind of, abrogate that in certain areas. So you have to make sure that we kind of all collectively agree on those and that all the stakeholders are brought in, citizens, employees, and so on. And then as you get alignment, moving through to make sure the right folks are plugged in at the right times, whether that's, vendors at the right stage, regulators, and so on.
Got it. Another question that's come up is you mentioned new revenue streams for the cities and for mayors. Sure. And making it a win-win situation. So like for the telco providers, how does that come together, or what's the best way to make those things happen?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a thing we've just started to look into. To be honest, we've looked at it mostly for the federal government, is like, how do you create these new revenue streams? But I think, again, if you think about it in a structured way, what you start to find is governments actually have a lot of really valuable things. Very often, they may not be seen as valuable because they're not super integral to the, government's functioning, how we deliver a particular service. But it can be incredibly valuable to other stakeholders. And this is especially true with things like smart cities, right, where you're generating a lot of data, and we live in an environment, right, where data is so valuable to everyone, for everything from advertising to and anything else, delivery of products. The key challenge is kind of like we just talked about in the previous question is, governments aren't companies, and they also need to be respectful and mindful of the duty they have to the citizens to protect that data, right? So it's like, just because you have something that's valuable and could sell it doesn't mean you should. But if you start thinking through it in that structured way, you may find that there are lots of opportunities to, even for municipal governments, to generate new revenue in ways that hadn't thought of. Good points.
And then another question that's come up is, where are good sources of information if you want to get started on a Smart Cities initiative? I know you had a couple things here, but any other sources or resources that you would point out for individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. I will, of course, plug Deloitte.com insights and all of our research. But I think, there's wide array of things out there. There's Smart City World Expo. There's a lot of those types of global and national groups coming together to talk about smart cities issues. Not just companies, but mayors and governors and government leaders talking about what's been successful for them. I'm sure Johnson Controls has lots of things to say, but I think it's just starting to read what's out there and thinking through what the local challenges are that you're trying to solve.
Got it. And then from your work, have you seen there is much in the difference in the size of a city that impacts the success. So again, we've got a couple of mayors with populations in that 70 to 100,000 range. Any difference that you've seen, whether it's a large city like a New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, London, versus somewhere like a Racine or a Kenosha?
I think there's positives and negatives for both, and I'll actually kind of draw an analogy to national governments. And I think it's, a national government like the United States compared to some smaller countries, say in Europe, just has so many more resources and so much more ability to do big, large-scale things, right? So we're thinking about, as you get more complicated, you need more upfront investment, right? And so larger governments are more able to do that, kind of front that upfront cost. But at the same time, they also have more stakeholders. Everything gets more complicated. So oftentimes, smaller governments can be more agile, right? You can try new things and do really interesting things. So for example, there's like a neat size window. I haven't looked in a few years, but I have to go back and crunch the numbers. But for a time, there was a neat size window of municipality where it was actually cheaper for them to get rid of their municipal bus systems and go to a ride-sharing perspective. And some of that was, sure, just subsidize Uber or Lyft. But others were like actual, municipal workers running a ride share within that town. So there's, that's something that you could never do at the scale of a New York City or a London or a Paris. So, strengths and weaknesses for both.
And it sounds where you're going with that is you touched on in your presentation about public-private partnerships. So I guess one of the things, if you tie, the data working together in with public-private partnerships, how do you determine what success looks like?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, comes back to this initial question of, hey, it's a collective goal and it needs to be established collectively up front. But also not just, hey, our goal is to do X, reduce homelessness or, improve commutes, but really putting something measurable to that, adding a data element, right? So it's like, we're going to improve commutes between these 2 points by this amount of time, those types of things. And I think you start to do that and you create a thing that's not just bringing people together initially to define what the problem is, but then also allowing them to kind of see the progress and get involved, as it begins to take shape and, kind of attracting people to success in a way.
Got it. And we've got time for one last question. And here looks like it's a little bit of a larger follow-up. So value capture is one method of alternative financing that has been suggested by Deloitte, and that is especially useful for funding transportation-oriented community development. Could this be used in southeastern Wisconsin?
I'm sure it could be. I'd have to, think specifically about specific applications. But I think that's kind of the major theme is, right? If we think through things in this structured process, there's all sorts of tools on the table, probably that we hadn't even thought of before, beyond just kind of the standard, straightforward approach of, problem technology, pay for technology, buying a box off the shelf kind of thing. So almost certainly, but what that would look like, I'd have to think about more.
Fair enough. And with that, I know there's more questions. What I'll do, just so everybody knows, what we'll do with the questions that come in that we can't get answered, I'll forward them to our speakers, and then we'll put them out on our website. We do have a website that we can put the information out on.